The night fires outside Moscow do not die, and in our timeline they become the glow of an empire collapsing, but in this one they become something far more dangerous, the light by which Napoleon Bonaparte sees the trap in time. He stands in a ruined city, hears no message from Tsar Alexander, watches the cold sharpen day by day, and for once he does not confuse silence with weakness. In that moment, before the snows close the roads, and before hunger begins to eat his army alive, the history of Europe turns on a decision measured not in speeches, but in days. The divergence point is simple and brutal. After entering Moscow in September 1812 and realizing Alexander will not negotiate quickly, Napoleon refuses to wait for a political miracle, abandons the dream of a ceremonial peace in the Kremlin, and moves south early with discipline, forcing the campaign away from the burned wasteland and toward the richer Kaluga region before winter fully strikes, then crushing the Russian attempt to block him near Maloyaroslavets and securing winter quarters instead of beginning the fatal retreat. From there, what was meant to be Russia's victory of attrition becomes a French strategic success that breaks the coalition system for a generation. To understand why this changes everything, you have to feel what 1812 really was for Europe, not just one campaign, but a test of whether Napoleon's empire was still a machine or only a legend running on momentum. He had already beaten Austria, humbled Prussia, redrawn maps, placed brothers on thrones, and made kings speak the language of reform, whether they liked him or not. But Russia was different because Russia could retreat forever, burn space itself, and let distance fight in its place. In our history, that is exactly what happened. The Grande Armée marched deeper, won at Borodino but paid heavily, entered Moscow, waited, froze, starved, and retreated through a landscape that seemed to have turned against human life. And once the myth of invincibility cracked, Europe pounced. In this alternate history, the crack never comes, at least not there. And the reason is not magic or a single glorious battlefield charge, but something almost anti-heroic. Logistics, timing, and Napoleon finally respecting the enemy's strategy enough to change his own. He enters Moscow, yes, and finds the city burning, yes, but instead of interpreting the fire as a theatrical gesture before surrender, he reads it as policy. Alexander is not coming. The Russians are not bargaining. The city itself has been denied to him, so he acts with an urgency he did not show in reality. Orders go out to prepare movement south while the roads are still passable. Units are reorganized around what they can actually feed. Horse losses are treated as a strategic emergency, not a temporary inconvenience. Foraging is redirected toward regions not already stripped bare by the advance. Most importantly, he does not commit the fatal sin of a conqueror in a vast country. He stops trying to own symbols and starts trying to own routes. Kutuzov, who in our timeline understood that time and weather were his allies, now faces a different problem. Instead of a French emperor paralyzed in the ruins of Moscow, he faces one who is moving aggressively toward the southwest, threatening to enter better provisioned territory and possibly winter there, which would turn a punitive expedition into a sustained occupation and political humiliation for the Tsar. The Russian command cannot simply watch. They must block. That means battle under pressure, and pressure is where Napoleon is still Napoleon. At Maloyaroslavets, or in a cluster of hard-fought actions around that axis, the French do not merely force a passage, but hold it, and that matters more than any dramatic final battle because it denies Russia the one thing it was counting on, a starving enemy stumbling back over the same ruined road to Smolensk. Now imagine the headlines in London and Vienna as autumn turns. Napoleon holds the interior. French army wintering in Russia. No collapse of the Grand Army. Panic does not always look like shouting. Sometimes it looks like cabinets delaying decisions, bankers hesitating, diplomats writing cautious letters, and kings suddenly becoming less brave than they sounded in private. Alexander, for all his resolve, is now in a bind. He can continue the war, but continued war means sustaining huge forces in the field through winter and risking more battles against an enemy still coherent, still dangerous, and still sitting on Russian soil. Russian patriotism remains fierce, but patriotism alone does not solve the problem of command friction, supply strain, and the political shock of failing to destroy the invader when the whole strategy depended on it. Napoleon, meanwhile, does what he does best after surviving a crisis. He turned survival into narrative. Bulletins from the army speak of endurance, discipline, and divine favor. Paris newspapers amplify every Russian withdrawal. Across Europe, officials who were quietly waiting for news of disaster now wait for terms. And then comes the next move, the one that makes this more than a saved campaign. Napoleon offers peace not as a plea, but as a settlement, and because he is a politician as much as a general, he frames it in a way that lets Alexander preserve face. He does not demand St. Petersburg. He does not try to occupy all of European Russia. He demands what he wanted strategically: Russia's re-entry into the continental system, recognition of French arrangements in Poland and Germany, and a reset of the diplomatic game that leaves Britain isolated on land. Alexander hates it, distrusts it, and almost certainly plans to break it later. But after a failed strategy of attrition, and with the French army not destroyed, a temporary peace becomes possible in a way it was not after a triumphant Russian winter. Even a limited armistice changes the map of time. Why? Because the Sixth Coalition, the one that in our history rose in 1813 on the certainty that Napoleon had bled out in Russia, now lacks its moment. Prussia does not leap so quickly. Austria does not mediate from a position of growing strength. German states do not switch sides in a wave once it becomes obvious the giant can fall. Everyone waits. Waiting is everything. Napoleon returns west not as a beaten man improvising with teenagers and old veterans, but as a ruler who has paid dearly but still holds the center. His cavalry arm is damaged, his manpower stretched, and his empire still overextended, but the political atmosphere is transformed. The difference between a wounded emperor and a doomed emperor is measured in alliances. In Paris, the court breathes again. In the ministries, men who had begun to fear the end of the system resume the daily business of empire. Taxation stays harsh, conscription remains hated, and censorship keeps grinding, but the machine does not enter emergency mode. In Berlin, officials who secretly dream of liberation now speak more softly. In Vienna, Metternich recalculates. He is still patient, still cynical, still looking for balance, but balancing against a Napoleon who survived Russia is a different art than balancing against a Napoleon expelled from it. Austria may still drift against France eventually, but not in the same year, not with the same confidence, and perhaps not with the same coalition strength. And in Britain, the strategic picture grows darker on the continent. The Royal Navy still rules the seas, British finance is still powerful, and the Iberian War still bleeds French prestige. But the hoped-for continental collapse has not arrived. Imagine the mood in London clubs as dispatches are read aloud. Relief that Russia still fights in spirit, frustration that the French army was not annihilated, fear that Britain must again carry too much of the burden alone. This is where the domino effect begins to widen beyond the battlefield. No catastrophic retreat means no immediate mass defections from the Confederation of the Rhine. No immediate mass defections means no Leipzig in the form we know it, no Battle of Nations smashing the French position in Germany at that exact moment, no rapid march of Allied armies to Paris in 1814. Without that sequence, there is no Bourbon restoration on the same timeline, no first exile to Elba, no 100 Days as a dramatic comeback, and no Waterloo as the final punctuation mark of an age. The famous end disappears, and when a famous end disappears, history does not simply continue quietly, it mutates. Napoleon's empire still has structural weaknesses, and this matters because we are not imagining an immortal superstate. National resentment in Spain remains intense. Guerrilla war still erodes French resources. Economic strain inside the continental system still causes black markets, smuggling, and elite frustration. French rule in Europe is still too personal, too centralized around one man's speed and authority. But the key difference is time. With no Russian catastrophe and no immediate coalition avalanche, Napoleon gets years instead of months, and years are enough to turn military conquests into institutions. He can rotate garrisons, negotiate marriages and guarantees, rebuild cavalry, and most importantly, normalize what had seemed temporary. A generation of administrators, judges, officers, and merchants across Western and Central Europe grows up under French legal norms, metric standards, codified administration, and careers open to talent. imperfectly applied, often hypocritically, but real enough to sink roots. The Napoleonic system stops looking like a storm and starts looking like weather. What does that do to Germany? It likely delays unification under Prussian leadership, because Prussia's historical rise depended heavily on the humiliation and then rebirth that followed the anti-Napoleonic wars, and especially on the prestige gained in the wars of liberation. Without that clear liberation moment, German nationalism still exists, perhaps even grows under French domination, but it develops more slowly and more unevenly, split between reformist federal dreams and anti-French romantic resistance without a decisive military victory to fuse them. A later German unification, if it comes, may come through diplomacy and economic blocs, or under Austrian influence, or after a very different mid-century crisis. And what about Poland, that constant wound in European politics? A French success in Russia strengthens the Duchy of Warsaw and possibly expands it, not necessarily into a fully restored Poland, because Napoleon was always pragmatic when it suited him, but enough to keep the Polish question burning in a way that permanently pressures Russia's western frontier. That alone changes Russian strategic priorities for decades. Inside Russia, the consequences are even more interesting. A victory, in the sense of expelling and destroying the French army, gave the Romanov state enormous prestige in our history. A failed strategy that ends in an uneasy settlement while French forces winter and withdraw on organized terms produces a different memory. Still patriotic, still anti-French, but tinged with frustration and elite blame. The Tsar remains powerful, but the aura of providential triumph is weaker. Russian officers who in our history marched west as liberators may instead spend more time arguing at court about reform, corruption, and preparedness. The Decembrist impulse may appear in a different form, perhaps earlier in some circles, because the regime cannot wrap itself in the same victory myth. Russia remains a giant, but a giant forced to modernize under the shadow of a campaign it failed to finish. And then there is Britain. The island kingdom does not suddenly lose. Its navy, industry, and global trade network remain formidable, and Wellington's campaign in Iberia still threatens French control. But a stronger Napoleon after Russia can reinforce Spain more intelligently or, at the very least, avoid treating the peninsula as a secondary theater while scrambling to rebuild in Germany. That could prolong the Peninsular War, increase its cost, and delay the moment when British prestige explodes on the continent. If Britain cannot combine sea power with a collapsing French land empire, then British influence in the post-war settlement is postponed because the post-war settlement itself is postponed. There is no Congress of Vienna in 1814 to 1815 because there is no such peace to organize. Think about that for a second. No Vienna system at the same time means no carefully engineered conservative order freezing Europe after Revolutionary War. No Metternich architecture in the form we recognize. No shared elite consensus so quickly restored. Europe remains revolutionary and imperial longer, not necessarily more free, but less settled. The 1820s become a far more volatile decade. Liberal movements in Italy, Spain, and the German states still rise, but now they rise in a continent where French power is still active and where the old dynasties are not fully restored. Some revolts may be crushed by French-backed rulers, others co-opted by Napoleonic reforms, and some may even seek French support against local absolutists, creating a strange political world in which the empire born from revolution poses as both order and change. Napoleon himself also changes under this timeline, because success in Russia would confirm his instincts and flatter his legend, but it might also teach him the one lesson he almost never learned in time, that winning does not always mean advancing farther. If he returns from Russia alive, undefeated, and politically dominant, he faces a choice between permanent mobilization and consolidation. In our history, he was dragged back into total continental war because his enemies saw weakness. In this alternate path, the absence of that immediate weakness gives him room to act like a founder rather than a gambler. Does he take it? That is the great question, and the most plausible answer is mixed. He consolidates enough to strengthen institutions but cannot resist intervention. He negotiates when it serves him, but keeps the empire armed and central. He grants selective constitutional facades in some client states while ensuring family control and military oversight. In short, he becomes less a conqueror on horseback and more a continental emperor-administrator, still brilliant, still feared, still exhausting everyone around him. France, under such a system, grows heavier, more bureaucratic, and more dependent on surveillance and tax extraction. But it also becomes the unquestioned political center of Europe for longer than anyone in London, Vienna, or St. Petersburg expected. The cultural effect would be enormous. French remains the language of courts and diplomacy, yes, but now even more deeply the language of law, engineering, military education, and elite ambition across Central Europe. A generation of officers from Italy to the Rhine serves under systems shaped directly by Paris. The Code Napoleon spreads wider and lasts longer, not as a legacy of a fallen emperor, but as the living operating system of the continent. Even anti-French nationalism becomes paradoxically French in structure, borrowing the language of citizenship, nation, merit, and state centralization that the empire itself popularized. And overseas, the ripple continues. A Britain forced to commit longer against a still dominant France on the continent may prioritize maritime empire even more aggressively and seek compensation in trade routes, colonies, and financial leverage. That can accelerate some imperial projects while slowing others. The balance in the Mediterranean shifts depending on whether a stronger French Europe can project influence through Italy and the Adriatic more consistently. The Ottoman Empire, often caught between powers, may find a different diplomatic environment, with Russia less triumphant and Austria less secure. Even the pace and shape of Latin American independence could shift at the margins, because European attention and legitimacy politics remain tied up in a Napoleonic order that refuses to die on schedule. None of this means Napoleon becomes master of the world. It means he wins the one campaign that historically made his enemies certain he could be beaten, and certainty is a weapon. Remove that weapon, and every later contest changes. There would still be war, resistance, economic pain, and eventually succession problems because an empire built around one man's will cannot escape biology. Napoleon would age. Illness, fatigue, family politics, and the problem of inheritance would grow. If he dies still in power after a stabilized settlement, Europe faces not the restoration of old dynasties after a clean defeat, but a succession crisis inside an imperial system that has had time to root itself. A Napoleonic dynasty with stronger institutions could survive him, especially if backed by the army and administrative elites across satellite states, but it would almost certainly fragment in stages. Yet even fragmentation would occur on Napoleonic foundations, producing a Europe whose laws, borders, and political habits evolved from prolonged French hegemony rather than from the conservative reset of Vienna. In schoolbooks of that world, the Russian campaign of 1812 is not taught as the beginning of the end, but as the campaign where Napoleon nearly lost everything and saved it by finally choosing movement over vanity, roads over ruins, supply over symbolism. Veterans would remember the smoke of Moscow and the mud of the southern roads, the desperate marches before frost, the smell of wet leather, horse sweat, and burnt grain, and the strange silence when the army realized it was not retreating to survive, but maneuvering to win. Russian memory would turn the same months into a story of endurance denied its final triumph, a wound that demands revenge and reform. British memory would remember the campaign as the year hope rose and then stalled. And Europe as a whole would live inside the consequences of that stall for decades, because once Napoleon proves he can enter Russia, escape the trap, and force the continent to keep bargaining with him, the age does not end at Waterloo with a clean moral lesson. It drags on, hardens, and remakes the 19th century into something colder, more centralized, and more French than the one we know, until one day people look around at their courts, their laws, their armies, their roads, even their measuring tapes and civil codes, and realize that the victory in Russia was not just a military reversal of fortune, but the moment an entire European future failed to break free when it still had the chance.